Okay, well, maybe we can start, throwing around some questions while everyone filters in after coffee. But
Wow.
oh my goodness, thank you. the Thank you all, everyone, all the presenters, all of you, for your engagement over these last 2 very intense days of thinking and talking about the issues around around global art history, around the practice of art history, and the sort of larger questions of how we, in the moment that we find ourselves, how we individually negotiate our practices as thinkers about, historians of, analyzers of, critics of visual culture or art, however we'd like to put that term. But one of the things that Jill and I thought we could go back to open things up, and this really is, I hope, an opening up, and that's why we've asked you all to kind of come down here as close as possible. One of the questions I wanted to go back to was the question that Alessandra answered so beautifully and simply, I thought, in the discussion after her paper when she was asked, when the question was thrown out, I think by Jim maybe, about how one translates a lot of these ideas into pedagogical practice. She said, well, you just do it. And then supplemented it by saying, well, you know about it, and then you just do it, which I thought was a beautifully simple and optimistic but also very profound answer to that question. To actually return to a question like that, which is, in a larger sense, how do we, not we as a collective, but we as individuals, think now about how one does it in our individual practices? I think a lot of what we heard was presenting work in which people were just doing it, but the question is, how does one get there in a certain sense? And so that's what I sort of wanted to open up and maybe ask people to comment, or everyone to sort of claim their stakes in that question.
Fantastic. If there's a mic.
Okay. Hi, Amanda Carlson. I'm an Africanist. I think about that a lot, and I'm glad you raised that, because that also stood out in my mind as well as to a high point of the 2 days. I foresee other conference themes that have come out, such as, when I was writing them down, language, archive, photography. And I could imagine in the archive conference that there would be a panel about, is it archiving or hoarding? And I can imagine that would be a fun conversation. Anyway, the more I thought about what everyone is talking about here, which is really innovation and knowledge creation, I just kept thinking about the euphoria that we feel in terms of recent technology products and the idea of innovation and technology. And I just felt like if we just had the right apps for art history, we'd be more relevant. And it kept coming back to, and I kept thinking, well, what would those apps be? What do I need? And but it really does come back to that central question. If we're exploding, in the 80s we were exploding the canons, now we're exploding art history, we're really just questioning our own relevancy. And so it's really, how do we apply this? And so I'm just kind of reaffirming that I think that is the central question. Anybody else would like to add? Please feel free.
I feel like we should be putting some of the panelists on the spot to make a claim.
Maybe I can.
Yeah.
I thought that the case studies that were presented here showed very nicely how, and it was very impressive how entangled art histories are already been practiced, and that the case study or the objects that you are studying are modifying the methodological and theoretical frame, so not the other way around. That's, I'm very upset now that I did something very theoretical in my talk and not a case study, because I thought that was much
There'll be
more.
a chance to revise.
And maybe I can tell you how we practice it in Berlin, because at the Free University in Berlin, we have now this kind of the art history department, and then we have sub-departments that cover regions, which is a bit problematic, of course. So we have Africa, and then we have America, and then we have East Asia and South Asia. But what we are trying to do is to connect them, and we have a master program called Art History in Global Context. And there are modules where we teach together. So there are some overarching, can you understand? Overarching kind of questions and critical terms like transculturality and things like that, that we try then to think about together, or practicing the entangled art histories. And we're trying now to do more co-teachings as well. So exactly what Alessandra said, you have the experts for various regions and trying to make them work together and also teach together. So you really can show these entanglements.
I take the point of that comment that a lot of things have come out of this conference, but I'm wondering if something else, at least for me, has come out of it, which is that maybe before we just begin to reproduce more and more conferences and expand art history in this way, maybe we should sit back and take a rest and really consider how art history might change as a result of this. And maybe we should consider also how we might change the institutions of conferences. Instead of having a lineup of speakers in this way, in this kind of architectural situation, maybe there could be a different kind of dialogue. Maybe there could be students who could be brought in. I don't know. Maybe there could be a different kind of hierarchy, or a negation of the hierarchy in some ways. Maybe there could be a challenge. I don't know. I'm just speculating on different possibilities for discussion and dialogue.
I agree entirely. I think the format has to be rethought, for our classes. And I'm sorry, but I disagree with Kirsten, because I think we don't know yet what we're going to do and how we are going to teach. It's every day when you go into the class, then a new idea comes up, and students bring back things, and they force you into showing things in another way. So there is no model that we could follow, pedagogical, neither this format for a conference. On the other hand, I think on the opposite, that we are seeing the fall of this structure, and I think that's what we were discussing here all the time. And pedagogically, it's again another challenge, how to deal with this, that we don't know how,
Are we going along?
Why can't we celebrate that?
Yeah.
This type of slippage away from why can't we celebrate a slippage from predominating narratives? Indeed, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was all the case studies were engaged, but no one seemed to address seriously, whatever it means, this global turn. Isn't the turn to the global itself one of slippage? That we are avoiding whatever it might mean, and that perhaps there isn't a turn toward the global at all. This might be a type of fiction that this impressive phalanx of colleagues are accepting, perhaps a little bit too unquestioningly. That all these things that we tend to read as globalizing might just be a series of our own projections, deriving from our own specificity of interests. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think, well, I'll finish one second. One of the things that I notice is a discomfort which I find very reassuring. That the strength of art history is that it is everything and nothing. And this flexibility, this malleability, is, I think, its greatest virtue. And therefore, seeing such diversity of methods invoked over the last 2 days all perhaps inflected towards interrogating a turn toward the global, even though that may not be taking place, is, I think, an indication of a healthy discipline, not one of illness, sickness, or even retrenchment.
Stephen, if you don't mind, I'm going to just jump in because we had this conversation yesterday, and I think it came up in questions yesterday, and I didn't answer, which I think I should, or we should, Jill and I. But it was a question about the way that the term was used to frame the conference and the question of the global turn. And I think probably all of us, whether we articulated it or not, have a different sense of what that term meant, and I think that sort of emerged over the course of the papers. For me, it was very specific, and for Jill, it might have been specific, but in a different way. For me, the global turn wasn't a turn towards attention to art from around the world, because obviously that has been present within art history from its very beginnings, as Tallinn's paper very much showed, right from its institutional beginnings in the European Academy. For me, it's an attention to art of the globe within the context of globalization and in a way that reproduces the fantasies of globalization. So, which is impossibly specific in a certain sense, and that's why it wasn't sort of, for me at least in my introduction, wasn't specified necessarily as such. And that's my investment in it. But I think other people on the stage have possibly very different investments in it. Oh, sorry.
Could I say something? Yeah. I was asked to teach Boston architecture, and my first, the history of architecture in Boston. And just because it was in the books, and my first reaction was, although I bit my tongue, was that, have you seen the size of Iran? How provincial. And then when I started to look into it, my way of turning it globally was actually teach it as if, as it was, in the sense that it being plugged in, Boston being plugged into the rest of the colonial world. So an obelisk in the middle of Boston or an Egyptian gate, it's not because of some kind of exotic, sort of spontaneous. I show my students how Boston is just another Algiers, is just another Bombay. And it's a larger part of a sort of bourgeois identity making.
Yeah, I really like that. So it would be like, teach as if there was such a thing as globalization, so that the global is not something that we take to exist, but it's something that we work on or in as if it did. I think that's a really good proposition, because it also prevents us maybe from this sort of this emphatic use of conferences like this always produce an enormous amount of pathos and emphasis, but maybe it would be really, a good idea to, in that sense, I really take up Stephen's suggestion, not to take this for granted, but as a proposition rather.
I just had a few reflections on basically, not to any one paper, but just, just observing the conference. One is that I think on the first day at least, there was, it wasn't clear to me whether we were talking about a global practice of art, or art as a kind of a networked or, practice that's really going on for, centuries, or we're talking about the modern discipline of art history, which is basically 1 or 2 centuries old, okay? So that was one thing that I think it's still important to keep those are two, in my opinion, two kind of separate issues. They have some relation, but they're two separate analytical issues, okay? Second is regarding even the term art and history. I think we should, when we are looking at non-Western materials, even the way art, art comes into the modern discipline of art history through certain framings. And I think we cannot let go of how those, those framings make, there are all sorts of examples, right? African materials from the 19th century were in ethnographic museums, and then they became art, right, in the 20th century. We all know that story, and And I think that that process is happening all the time. It in some ways becomes invisible to us because we just recognize art objects as recognizable art objects without understanding how the discipline creates its object. Okay, so that's another thing I think we need to pay attention to. The third thing is, when we talk about there is also a great deal of imbalance in terms of, here we are kind of, talking about art history in angst and so on, about what it's not able to do, etc. But in many parts of the world, there aren't even departments of art history, right? So in the sense that, the American academia can actually play a very positive role by just doing studies, of learning languages, looking at unexamined sort of archives and just doing that work, and also in a sense creating collaborations with, academies and universities across the world, which I think would be a very positive, move that the discipline itself can do, rather than us, staying within the orbit of the United States or the Western Europe and just thinking about deconstructing the discipline, So I think all these things have to be thought together, in my opinion.
The term entanglement came up quite a few times over the last 2 days. And just now, entanglement as the tangling up of method with the case study or what you're working on. And entanglement seemed, one way in which you could understand it would be this relation between, that's one of not. Right, they entangle suggests you can't move the comb through smoothly. And in one sense, that knot could seem like a really good negative pushback to one of the ways of characterizing globalization, which is our complicity with, enfoldedness with, a certain creation of the world as this smooth surface that circulates things and ideas without any friction, without any resistance. But at the same time, I'd like to think about that relation between an even enfolding and unfolding of method with object, of practice with the things that we study but that we also make. As an aspect of a global turn, which is not necessarily a turn toward the global, and that was something that both Aruna and I, and I think in fact many of the conference participants have laid in over the last couple of days, and that is that the world, or the globe, we may speak of it as if it is a given, and there are certainly many techniques to make it seem as though it is a given. But our refusal to, if we do, to examine and work with the ways in which we are continuing to make that world. And one of the things that we began with is Jean-Luc Nancy's rearticulation of Derrida's distinction between globalization and mondialization, to insist that the globe is something that we make, that it's a question of practice. So in asking that at the end of the conference or the beginning of what we'll do next would be an emphasis on praxis, is also to not only act as if we are amidst globalization, but also to take on the ethics and politics, the responsibility of thinking what practices do we need to world the world in which we would want to live and work and even thrive. And I see that as not something that I can complacently take as a given of my participation in the field of art history or as a given of my institutional location. So I would ask again the question of what praxes, what practices, what micro-techniques, what prepositional tactics might world the world in which we would want to live our lives. And even the notion of the good life seems something to ask in precarious times such as these, which I do think are deeply precarious.
Since the word praxis has been used on a number of occasions, I just want to go back to what was described as practice at the Free University, in other words, pedagogy. How might some of these ideas be actually put into practice of teaching. And I was once involved, and actually more than once, in a course called Multiple Modernities, which was a wonderful experiment of a kind, which drew together at Columbia University's large faculty. So there were a number of people who represented so-called non-Western fields, everything from Iranian art to contemporary Latin American art, and so on. People who had specializations in these fields came together to teach. One of the interesting things about that was that none of the people involved in so-called Western modernism cared to participate. There was no representation of the dominant modernism. So it was, you know, the ghettoized modernisms had come together to talk, but there was the people they were talking to, or perhaps against, weren't there. That was one interesting thing about this course. The other thing is that it tended to be sort of descriptions about what was going on, what contemporary art was being produced in all of these different parts of the world. And very little commonality. I mean, it was very interesting that the discussion sort of slid by each other without engaging. There was very little opportunity to sort of work out what the theoretical parameters of the work that was done in these fields might amount to. Anyway, that's just an anecdote, but it leads me to think about the relation between the different narratives that might be produced about multiple modernity or multiple contemporaneity. Are they going to be freestanding narratives of their own, or how are these narratives going to be interlaced with one another? That seems to be one of the important questions.
I wanted to propose one observation, and that is, I was thinking about what were the repetitions through the couple of days and even for the last few contours of what we said. And these observations may be, one, wrong, inaccurate, or even if they're true for the last few days, this may be just we're the wrong sample group. But if this is art history in the wake of the global turn, what does it look like? And I was thinking about the geography of it and how refreshingly minimal was the presence of North America and Western Europe in this, and how there was some debate a few days ago of whether art history was a 19th century discipline, and whether the inheritance of art history is a heavy or a completely irrelevant weight. And I would just say that it did come up in a few papers, but maybe not many, where Rome had to be displaced, where 19th century France had to be displaced, where Vasari had to be displaced. So this is a sort of observation about like geographies and the weight of maybe a classical tradition in the field or non-weight. And the second one had to do with periodization, that I think if we had a conference and similar people here assembled to talk about in the last few years the city or class or formalism or media, that we wouldn't have the same mix of periods brought out to be discussed, to talk through our problem of the moment. And in that, except for the two photography talks, the late 19th century was virtually absent. That sort of legacy of the narrative of high modernism, not here. The early modern came back in huge force, and I think a little bit of the early 19th century, perhaps for reasons I'll talk about in a second. So there's a kind of, we're concerned with different periods. It's reshuffled in terms of that, at least this group in these days. And the other part that occurred to me is that one of the subjects that came up very often, and a subject which would have been in terrible odor for a very long time, were stories of origins. And they were super multiple and engaged with, usually, with fervor and delight, and that if anything's exploded, maybe in the art history in the wake of the global origins, it's the stories of origins, perhaps.
Hi, I just want to give a response to Keith's example. I mean, maybe it will be a counterexample, and just 2 days ago, we were doing this workshop, which brought together scholars of East Central Europe and Africa. I mean, a group that usually perhaps didn't come together that much. And there were also scholars working on India and so on. And what struck me in that workshop, or at least perhaps moments of it, was the fact that, for instance, scholars working on East Central Europe said, first we thought post-colonial theory was really not applicable to post-Soviet studies, but there was a moment afterwards where these theories were inspiring for what we were doing. So, I mean, in a way, perhaps there are moments of dialogue or shared or attempts to theorize how to come to terms with multiple modernities. I don't know, maybe in that course that didn't happen, I wasn't there, but in the workshop that we had, I think that certainly happened, at least at moments. And one thing that I wanted to bring out, I mean, in that workshop, one of the themes that seemed to appear again and again was the question, something that goes like this, I mean, wouldn't it be more responsible today to move away from a commitment to untranslatability, to difference, to incommensurability, all those theoretical frameworks of the mid-1980s and 90s? Wouldn't it be more responsible for today's scholarship to move away from those commitment to untranslatability to a new commitment to translatability, to shared frameworks and networks and so on? So I was wondering if the metaphors or some of the concepts that came up in the conference, like exploded or fear-filled field, or again, untranslatable, or beauty being defined as something in the Western discourse, and that's why it's not applicable to non-Western. I mean, I wonder if those were still in the framework of that untranslatability mode, and so how would you respond to that question in the workshop about a commitment to shared frameworks and a commitment to translatability without perhaps repeating the older kind of imposing universalist framework?
Can I? Oh, okay, I have this. I don't know if it's working. It's working. Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Ezra. I think that's a really great point. And it is important to remember that where we can take this forward is exactly not to sort of go backwards, but think about translations, about communication, about ways of resolving things, and maybe taking a more active role than perhaps we have usually in the past as in the academy in general. But I was sort of struck, and it's connected to this point, that something that Nick brought up about this right to see, about where one may position oneself, in the sidewalk or in the park, where are you allowed to be, to see. And that positioning is really important when we think about how we perform our own practice, whether it's art history or teaching or whatever it might be. But thinking, again, you know, of Tahrir Square or Zagoti Park, but also to remember the revolutions that haven't happened, right? Like the Jasmine Revolution that didn't happen in China, or Bahrain, that things actually are broken, destroyed, exploded perhaps, in the service of removing memories. And one thing that we can do as historians is to remember and to resurrect those things that are not possible, and to claim them and make them our own. But also to maybe move away from the idea of simply seeing, but to building, to making your mark. Again, you know, to use something that Nick said, but whether it's institutions or programs, but to think in terms of productivity as well as what we do. Might be, it's a different framework than just documenting that perhaps we often tend to do.
Yeah. Go ahead. No, I'm just thinking a little bit about the antiquity of the global turn, not its recent provenance. And I think that's been thought of a lot. I mean, if we look at images of the globe itself, there is a certain antiquity to the images of the globe. And they don't all come from just one place. And they do gain currency at times. I know that in the 16th century, in the Mughal miniature tradition, there's lots of pictures of globes. There's the king of, there's Jahangir embracing, you know, Shahbaz on a globe. It looks a little like Sarkozy and Angela Merkel. And I think they're having a similar problem. They've got their own Greece, which is, Baluchistan, which is kind of a problem, and it has to be settled. So they need to do this thing. There's a wonderful painting of another Mughal miniature painting of Moinuddin Chishti, a Sufi saint, presenting a globe to a sovereign and saying, "Look, this is the world. Take responsibility for it." And I think that these are, if one were to track these images of globes or maps of the world, if one were to think of Borobudur as a map of the world, if one is to think of Melanesian star charts and navigation systems, something that we've begun thinking about a lot as maps of the world, and there are clearly world pictures at play, and there have been for a long time. And histories of practice are histories of world picturing. The turn away from the global turn was, I think, a momentary thing. I mean, in consciousness and in thought. I mean, I'm curious about the fact that as we go into antiquity, we do find divisions between barbarians and civilized people, between known and unknown worlds. And remember, everybody's barbarian is somebody else's civilized person. So, the ancient Iranians obviously thought of the Greeks as barbarians, and they say so, just as much as the other way. But it's not as if they don't actually have a sense of a universe larger than themselves. It's only perhaps since the Treaty of Westphalia and since the nation-state system that we've had this momentary sort of lapse into world pictures that are smaller than larger world pictures. And it's obviously now that particular variant of transatlantic capitalism is facing a crisis. It sees a smaller horizon, and obviously then there are other worlds. And it's a belated recognition of the fact that, Western modernity is one of the multiple modernities. That's welcome. The point is then not to assume that that the state of your discipline is either in health or in crisis, but to recognize the temporality and the impermanence of your own conclusions, and start from that principle, which means that perhaps to go back to the question of practice, to understand histories of practice and to understand the theory that is produced by practice, to understand practice as knowledge, to understand the fact that the person who, obviously the person who painted the picture of Shah Abbas and Sarkozy, Shah Abbas and Jahangir embracing, he or they had to learn how to make the world in their drawing. The city that I come from has Shah Jahan's magnificent mosque, which is commonly referred to as the Juma Masjid, which is Friday Mosque, which is a meaningless name. Every mosque is a Friday mosque. But it does have a proper name, and which is the Masjid Jahannuma, which means it's the mosque that looks out at the world. And that is its proper name. And there is a place in the mosque where there is a strange, crude 18th century map of the world scrawled onto a plinth. And it includes a little bit of Australia, which I find really interesting, that someone's done that effort. And the reason why that effort has been made is to point out the fact that there are different times, and they're struggling with the problem of longitude. Obviously, it's not been resolved satisfactorily in Delhi at that time, but they're pointing out the fact that directions of prayer to Mecca and time have still got to be sort of worked out. But if you were here and if you looked at this diagram, you would understand, as Kishwar pointed out with the hadith, that the world is a mosque, and if the world is a mosque, then you have to look for your directions wherever you are. I mean, that is a history of a certain kind of practice of everyday life. And that everyday life has always been adequately, inadequately, completely, or incompletely worlded. But it's not been unworlded.
Yes, I just wanted to defend a little bit the concept of untranslatable in the meaning that this French philosopher gives, which is absolutely not something that cannot be translated. And I think it is exactly what we are meaning here, no? This process of untranslatability as a process of something that keep being translated. And we had this conversation during the coffee break with Jim. I bring here a question which can seem very banal, but how do we do with the different languages of these objects? Not different languages, art historical languages, but really the languages of these treaties, of these artists. I mean, we are here doing this exercise in English, and it's wonderful, but in classes, for instance, I cannot teach to my students without asking them to read Spanish and Portuguese, not because these texts are untranslatable in the bad sense, because in the process of confronting the English with these original languages, something happens. When I translated for the audience the Guevara and Hollanda, something happened there. So I just wanted to bring this question of,
maybe I should...
I was going to say, except what Alexander said, because I thought your notion of untranslatability was a commitment to perpetual translation. So I didn't, I didn't refer to your...
No.
I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this because you didn't say it, but during the conversation during coffee, you said something I thought was somewhat incendiary, and that was that you couldn't have taught this in an art history department, which goes against the self-description of a lot of art history departments.
No, it's, let's say, I could not organize my syllabus as it is organized this semester for this department in an art history department, which doesn't mean that I could not organize it differently. This is why I bring the question here. So how do we force also art history to be put under pressure of these different linguistic realities? Sorry, but it's basic, I think.
I wanted to, go ahead. I wanted to develop the issues of pedagogy a little bit in two related directions. First of all, in relation to what TJ was saying about conference formats and things like that, there is this conventional thing that's often said during conventions, that conventions are conventional and people should try to think their way out of them and so on. There's part of the Westernness of art history, as far as I'm concerned, is institutions, and the convention, I suppose maybe Ivan might know the history of conventions of the form we've just had, but one of the salient features of it is the paper, which is 20 minutes to 45 minutes or so. Things outside that, things outside that range somehow don't quite work, and that would be one concrete thing that could be talked about in relation to that issue. The other thing, to develop something that Todd was saying, something Keith was saying, I've been involved in the last couple of years in an attempt, probably futile, to write an answer to Art Since 1900 with several people. And the problems that this project raises are exactly the ones that Keith raised. And so if we were to talk about pedagogy, one of the things that would be interesting to me would be, imagine that this was like the first meeting of a 10-year project involving all of us to write a book, right? In other words, to make a unified, coherent, at least, response or answer or project ourselves in some sense. In that case, what would the shape of these exploded parts be? One of them would be, like in Alessandra, in your talk, it would be alternate narratives, newly sprung into life and put beside other narratives. Others would be historiographic interventions, and a lot of the rest of it would be, could be talk about what we mean by globalization and these other fundamental concepts. But what would it be as a project?
But that assumes that what one does once one explodes something is try and put it back together. And I'm not sure that that's...
Yeah, no, I don't at all want to project that that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But it seems to me this is one of the few really potentially fruitful and discrete ways of thinking, concrete ways of thinking about what pedagogic consequences there are to whatever we've done. So in other words, the result could be itself fragmentary, but the question is, what is the form of it?
Something that was embedded in, I think, Stephen's remark originally, which was, why aren't we just happy with this fragmentation and celebrate this extraordinary variety that we've seen in the number of approaches that the presenters use? So you talk about a book. A book is a unified thing. It has a front and a back, and it has a sequence of pages inside. And the convention that you didn't address is the convention of these gatherings, which is at the end we have a round table, and we sit and we try to reintegrate in some fashion what we've all learned, when I thought the point was to break it apart or to show the ways in which it has already been broken apart. So, and the other part, I think, of the conference that was interesting.
I gave you the prompt to reintegrate.
Pardon?
Just think practice, which could go in many different directions.
And why not?
Could I add on to that thought? I was thinking about the breakout session. Why don't we do breakout sessions? Why doesn't this continue on into other conversations and other formats? I don't know enough about the process of the events prior to this week, but what if this did roll into other projects that extended beyond the physicality of being in a conference room? And even if we're thinking about pedagogy and expanding dialogues and collaboration, there is no reason to be confined to a classroom in today's day and age. There's no reason not to collaborate with institutions in other countries, to co-teach with colleagues, to develop classes together. And I think enough of that doesn't happen.
Well, I just want to, in terms of this sort of question of the convention of the convention, I do want to explain something about where this is placed in the larger RAP projects, because although this conference has a form that's maybe a familiar form, it is both the product of a series of events and seminars that has happened around the globe over the last 6 years, and that will continue in various forms. It was preceded by a workshop that was not presenting papers, but in fact the product of questions that were produced by the participants in advance of the workshop and then worked through during the workshop. It's being followed by a residency where people who were involved in a prior project are coming through. It is being followed by events that will start in Sydney that will go on for 3 years. So, I mean, there's a form to this conference, but I don't think that and there's a form. You know, we have a roundtable at the end of our conferences, but I don't think that within the larger context of what this intellectual event does, that it's entirely sort of imagining that these questions start here, end here, we come together with a roundtable, and then the question is over and we move on to the next thing. This is very much part of an ongoing institutional practice that, you know, so excuse me for my moment of defensiveness, but there you go.
So one of the things that strikes me about all this is, you know, I speak as somebody who doesn't work in an art history department anymore. You guys are really worried about this. I mean, about like what art history is and like, you know, how it disciplines as a discipline. And that seems to me not a particularly productive worry. That seems to me to be a kind of worry about that leads to administrators thinking about consolidating and annihilating. I don't see, you know, the tension between the so-called case study and the so-called theoretical project here. I didn't read it that way. I read it as people who were worried about the disciplines and people who were worried about what they're doing and trying to and not being bounded by some sense of an obligation to some given modality that you have to pay obeisance to because. And finally, I would say, like, in relation to the convention of the convention, this has been completely uninvented. I mean, outside of art history, I'm sorry, you know, I mean, if you go to a digital media conference, nobody does this. People present for 5 minutes, and then they break up into workshops. If you want to write a book, you write it during the convention. It takes... Seriously, you know, over 3 or 7 days, the books are written. We don't talk about 10-year books. Who knows? What would be the point of setting out to write a book in which there was going to be a chapter about the Occupy movement that was going to be published in 10 years? You know.
So I just wanted to make a, you know, before the discussion has already moved on in different directions, but I just wanted to reiterate something that both Alessandra and mentioned, which is the question of really history, right, and the question of translation. Because one of the things, two things I was trying to say in my earlier comment was the question of art and history, right? So in the context of history, of course, you know, we talk about the discipline as being 1 century or 2 centuries old. But of course, when we look at other sort of, you know, modalities, practices across time, then I think there's no, I mean, even in the way we've set it up, we have certain concepts that we are using here, like the turn or globality or mondialization or entanglement, which are, I think, enabling us to think in a certain way, but can also limit us because we are using English or French or whatever, right? And if you were to look at, for example, art from a certain region and, at a certain time, whether it's the world map produced by Borobudur or something, or a certain kind of an imagination or a practice that might have to do with issues of poetics or issues of other, conceptions that have to be brought in. So I think I worry a little bit about, that's why I'm completely in agreement with you that we shouldn't force there is no one frame of doing. There are interesting, many, I think it's a very, I think I'm very optimistic about the discipline. I think it's a great time. Things have opened up. Okay, there's plenty to do, okay? And we should do it. We should go ahead and do it and not worry about whether it's art history or not, okay?
No, I just want to talk a little bit about this anxiety with language, because it's come up again and again. And I don't want to seem to be a partisan of the English language as it is at the moment, which I am, but let's keep that aside. I think there have been various times in which the thing we have to think about is what's being said and how is it being said, rather than obsess about whether the language in which it is being said is or is not an instrument of power, because I am not yet aware of a language that is not an instrument of power. Of course, there are instruments of power to different degrees depending on the armies that speak those languages. But given the fact that the power and influence of armies also wanes, so do the fortunes of languages. I mean, in the early medieval period, Greek became a really insignificant language in the Arabic-speaking world, but there was a tremendous effort to translate everything from Greek, precisely because Greek was an insignificant language and a weak language. So the strong language had to do the work to ensure that the knowledge, that the inheritance that it had received from the language that it defeated continued. And that's a way in which defeated peoples enter history and re-enter history, because they actually make their presence felt in the language of their conquerors. And I think something like that's going on with English today. English is the great medium of translation because it is the one language in which we can all deposit everything and then not worry about the future, because once it's been deposited in English, when English itself fades, as it will, surely in 200 years' time, these conferences will happen more in Chinese than in English. But then there will be an effort to recover this material from the English language, as has happened in the past. I mean, in material that I'm familiar with, the entire Sanskrit canon in Buddhism was lost to South Asia and can now be recovered because the Chinese had the intelligence to translate everything into Chinese. And that's fine. So my concern with as a person for whom English is not my mother tongue, I'm happy to be able to slip between English and other languages because it provides me that perpetual opportunity to deposit materials between one language and another.
Yeah, but this is exactly the point, between and from one language into another. I do not want to give the impression to be a fetishist of the language and that if you speak Nahuatl, you have a proximity to these aesthetics. Absolutely not. But I think that something happened when,
that point. I mean, it's also important to realize that, for instance, Lawrence Venuti in his book Scandals of Translation gives some numbers. I don't remember the precise numbers, but English now is the language that's most translated from, but least translated into, which is a very surprising fact. I mean, in a way, if we really want translation to act, to do what you're saying,
what's the language that's most translated into?
I don't have that. I mean, you can check the book and he has the numbers, but English, which you would hope that is the language that's most translated into, is actually the opposite. So for translation to do what you hope it to do, there's also, you know, a need for the publishers and the institutions who hold that power of translation to make a commitment to translating from other languages. Otherwise, it won't do what you're hoping it to do.
Can I say something about language? Just one word?
I hope very much that these conversations will continue, but I am keeping my eye on the clock and realizing we've kept you all here a tremendously long time, and since Jivesh has now started to occupy the auditorium, I'm feeling like this might be a very good time to stop. Thank you all for your participation and your engagement over these 2 days, and just thank you. This was great. Thanks very much.